Rolling back Obama's Cuba policy, Trump announces he's tightening travel rules and banning businesses with companies linked to the country's military. Helmut Kohl, Germany's longest-serving post-war chancellor, dies aged 87. He leaves behind the legacy of reunifying divided Germany. And public anger boils over in London as the death toll in the Grenfell Tower fire climbs to 30. Authorities facing heavy criticism over cutting corners with fire safety in social housing. Hello and welcome to France 24. I'm Catherine Clifford. We begin with the news just breaking of a collision between a US Navy destroyer and a Philippine-flagged container ship, this off the south coast of Japan. And this according to the US Navy's 7th Fleet, which said one injured US sailor was evacuated and taken to hospital. A US official has said the ship's still working to account for all personnel. Meanwhile, Japanese media have just reported that 7 US crew members are missing in that collision. We'll bring you more information on this developing story as we get it. And continuing to unpick the work of his predecessor, US President Trump is rolling back on parts of Obama's Cuba policy. Speaking in Miami this Friday, Trump said his new changes would tighten up travel rules and cut back on funds sent to the country. But he's not going back on diplomatic and commercial ties and won't close the US embassy there. Alan Gainsford tells us more about Trump's stance.
Taking a tougher stance on Cuba, Donald Trump is following through with his campaign pledge, announcing new restrictions on trade and travel to the island. He's rolling back some of Barack Obama's historic opening to Havana.
It's hard to think of a policy that makes less sense than the prior administration's terrible and misguided deal with the Castro regime. The previous administration's easing of restrictions on travel and trade does not help the Cuban people. They only enrich the Cuban regime.
Americans traveling to Cuba will be more tightly monitored to ensure that they fit into the 12 authorized categories, including educational, humanitarian, artistic or trade purposes, but not for general tourism. And Trump plans to clamp down on US business dealings with the island's military. Cuban security forces have links to all sectors of the economy, including tourism.
The profits from investment and tourism flow directly to the military. The regime takes the money and owns the industry. We do not want US dollars to prop up a military monopoly that exploits and abuses the citizens of Cuba.
But he's not turning back the clock completely. The president will leave many of Obama's steps towards normalization intact. Diplomatic relations will remain, as will commercial flights. Ending an embargo of more than half a century, Obama's opening to Cuba was regarded by his administration as one of its signature foreign policy achievements.
And our Washington correspondent Philip Crowther spoke to us a little earlier. He told us more about just how far the rollback goes.
The Trump administration will be saying that this is pretty much an entire reversal, but it certainly is not. A lot of what President Barack Obama put in place is still in place and will remain in place. Most notably, the biggest symbol of them all, the presence of 2 embassies in the respective capitals, which were opened during the Obama administration. The U.S. Embassy in Havana will remain. The Cuban Embassy in Washington, D.C. will as well. And that, of course, symbolizes the fact that diplomatic relations between the 2 countries will also remain in place. Now, what will be more difficult to do is, first of all, trade with Cuba. American companies will have it that little bit harder to invest in Cuba and to establish business relations, simply because of what you just saw in that report. According to the Trump administration, too much of that money goes directly toward the Castro regime. And according to Donald Trump, the same happens with money that is spent by tourists. So it's going to be more difficult for individual American tourists to make it to Cuba. But whole groups who go for a specific reason they won't have all that much of a difficulty. The flights will still be in place, and cruise ships will still be able to go to Cuba as well. The changes are not as drastic as Donald Trump might have you believe.
Helmut Kohl, the man behind German reunification and Germany's longest-serving post-war chancellor, has died at the age of 87. German Chancellor Angela Merkel has paid tribute to her late mentor, describing him as the right man at the right time, as French President Emmanuel Macron lamented the loss of a great European who brought France and Germany into their modern friendship. Mark Thompson brings us more on his legacy.
It was one of the defining moments of Helmut Kohl's political career. Just weeks after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Kohl set the gears of reunification in motion. And it's what the late German Chancellor wanted to be remembered for.
We Germans don't have too many reasons to be proud of our history, but I have every reason to be proud of those years when I was Chancellor. I have nothing better, nothing to be more proud of than German reunification.
Born in southwest Germany in 1930, Helmut Kohl became leader of the conservative CDU party in 1973 and eventually chancellor just under a decade later. Along with his contemporaries, British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and US President Ronald Reagan, Kohl advocated free market capitalism. But unlike Thatcher, he was strongly pro-European. In 1984, during commemorations for World War I, Kohl famously held hands with the then French President François Mitterrand, a symbol of European reconciliation. He was also instrumental in the introduction of the single European currency. Kohl served 2 terms as Chancellor of West Germany. Then, in 1990, in the first free pan-German elections for 60 years, he returned to power with a landslide victory. But his popularity waned as the reality of a reunified Germany set in. Unemployment rose and government spending was cut. After his 4th term as Chancellor, Kohl suffered a heavy defeat in the 1998 general election. He was replaced by the Social Democrat leader Gerhard Schröder. After the defeat, Kohl resigned as leader of the CDU, but his retirement wasn't quiet. He fought off allegations that he accepted illegal donations for the party. In 1999, he finally admitted to taking cash, but refused to name the donors. The fallout from the scandal helped Angela Merkel rise to the party leadership. There were difficulties in Kohl's personal life too. In 2001, his wife Hannelore Kohl committed suicide. Her death led to speculation from the normally reticent German media about Kohl's private life and his relationship with his longtime assistant Maike Richter. A fall in 2008 led to a fractured skull and a stint in intensive care. The accident left him partially paralysed with impaired speech. He married Richter soon after, but towards the end of his life became increasingly withdrawn from the public.
And for more on what Helmut Kohl means to modern-day Germany, France 24's Berlin correspondent Jessica Saltz filled us in.
Helmut Kohl is seen as a very, very important statesman here in Germany. He was Chancellor for 16 years. They speak of it as the Kohl generation. Many Germans here still remember when he was firstly leader of West Germany and then forged reunification and was leader of a united Germany. And this reunification was no easy feat, not only a political and economic overhaul, but Kohl really had to work hard to convince dubious West and East Germans that they belonged together in one united country. They were of the same soil, he said. And Germans today, the vast majority, very, very happy that Germany did unify, and they credit Helmut Kohl for this. They also, of course, credit him for being one of the architects of the European Union, which at the beginning was also Germans had their doubts about, but are now very grateful about. Helmut Kohl, in a way, a man of contradictions. He was a man who was, in many ways, very provincial. He was always teased for speaking in his dialect and liking to invite important leaders to his hometown in Rhineland-Palatinate, but also a very important important player on the international scene. He was cantankerous and stubborn at times, but also really forging for unity within Germany. And he was also a man who, his political career and also personal life was punctuated by scandal and also by tragedy, but also someone who in Germany remains a very, very treasured and respected statesman.
The Democratic Republic of Congo's top opposition figure, Moise Katumbi, has announced he's to return to the country after fleeing a year ago. Katumbi's decision comes after the UN urged Kinshasa to let him take part freely and safely in future presidential elections. Speaking in Paris this Friday, Katumbi called for change in the Central African nation.
My idea for Congo first is a wake-up Congo, stand-up Congo, if I can say that. And what is important for me is to give a better life to the Congolese people. Congo is one of the richest countries in the world, and today Congo is the poorest country in the world. I think what is important for me is to give a real change, not a change on the paper, on a change like what I did in the Katanga province.
Anger is spilling over in London following the fire that engulfed the 24-storey Grenfell Tower block, killing at least 30 people. Dozens stormed the local town hall, accusing authorities of not doing enough to fireproof social housing, cutting corners to save money. Crowds booed and heckled Prime Minister Theresa May as she visited victims after being criticised for avoiding locals. She'd said there were security concerns, only to be shown up when Queen Elizabeth went to meet with victims earlier on Friday, as Tika Laurent reports.
It was a heartwarming visit from Britain's royals. Queen Elizabeth and Prince William met with volunteers, firefighters and the survivors of Wednesday's Grenfell Tower blaze. Dozens of people are still unaccounted for, many of whom were trapped on the upper levels of the 24-floor skyrise.
Every day I'm looking at that building, I'm like, God help these people, you know. I'm just hoping they're in hospital, you know. They've made it through the stairway, got out. Everyone, not just my family, every single person in there.
Meanwhile, drones and sniffer dogs continued the desperate search for survivors in the charred, hollowed-out residential tower.
It is going to take a period of time for our specialists, both from the police and the London Fire Brigade, to fully search that building to make sure we locate and recover everybody that has sadly perished in that fire.
Prime Minister Theresa May finally visited survivors in hospital on Friday morning after coming under criticism for failing to meet with them immediately after the fire broke out. Residents' associations are angry over the lack of fire safety measures and, in particular, flammable plastic cladding fitted on the inside of the tower. Inhabitants of other buildings are worried about similar fires breaking out in their homes.
The buildings were designed in the same way. They all have one exit, and potentially stairways can be trapped the same way people were trapped, so they don't know at all. And there's the issue of fire alarms. They don't have fire alarms.
The cause of the blaze is still unknown, but London's police say there is no indication that the fire was deliberately set.
And here in France, an important medical figure has passed away. Christian Cabrol has died in Paris at the age of 91. A pioneering heart surgeon, Cabrol made history when he performed the very first heart transplant in Europe in 1968. He performed almost 2,000 transplants in his life and helped raise awareness on organ donation. And to delve further into any of the stories we've been covering tonight, you can head to our website, www.france24.com, and you can see there our top story, Trump's partial rolling back on Obama's Cuba deal. And that's all we have time for. Join us again for more news coming up here on France 24.